Dubro Suspicion Files.
So let's set the scene. April 1st, 2003, Hong Kong.
Yeah, and if you were there, you remember that atmosphere. It was more than just the weather.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't psychological. The city wasn't, celebrating April Fool's Day. It felt like it was suffocating.
It was. The air was thick, heavy, not just with that harbor humidity, but with this palpable, invisible terror.
We're talking about SARS. The severe acute respiratory syndrome epidemic had turned one of the loudest, most vibrant cities on Earth into a silent, masked ghost town.
And right into the heart of that isolation, that fear, at 6:43 p.m., a tragedy happened that I think still defines the collective grief of a generation.
We're talking about the moment Leslie Cheung Kwok-wing, who everyone knew as Gore, Big Brother, fell from the 24th floor of the Mandarin Oriental Hotel.
And he wasn't just another celebrity. You have to understand, he was a cultural avatar. He was the face of Hong Kong's golden age.
The spectrum he covered is just incredible. I mean, think about it. The tough, honorable gangster in John Woo's A Better Tomorrow.
And then, on the complete other end, the achingly vulnerable queer protagonist in a Wong Kar-wai film like Happy Together or, of course, Farewell My Concubine. He could be both.
And then, in an instant, he was gone. And it just left this vacuum.
A vacuum that 2 decades on hasn't really healed. It's sort of hardened into mythology. The shock, combined with the lockdown secrecy of SARS, it was the perfect breeding ground for denial.
And that is exactly why we're here. This deep dive is for you, the listener. Our mission is to be the definitive fact-checking resource.
We're going to try and traverse that deep, difficult chasm between what we know is the medical reality, and that involves severe depression, and surprisingly, GERD, and the mythology of denial.
Right, all the persistent, desperate rumors, murder, political hits, fake deaths, even those bizarre claims that popped up again in 2025.
So we're going to be looking at this through 2 different lenses. First, from the perspective of a cultural historian, to really get the weight of the icon he was.
And second, with a criminal investigator's eye. Scrutinizing the facts, the timeline, and dismantling those supposed forensic anomalies that the conspiracies just cling to.
This is so much more than a celebrity death story. It's a forensic look at how we, as a society, grapple with the uncomfortable, almost mundane truth of biological illness when it claims someone we see as untouchable.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So to understand that final collapse, you really have to start at the beginning. You have to understand the foundation of the man.
Leslie Cheung, born Cheung Fat Cheung in 1956. And his early life, despite all the later success, was defined by this profound emotional isolation, wasn't it?
It really was. It was defined by absence right from the start. He was the youngest of 10 kids, but really grew up separate from his siblings.
And his father, Chung Lupoi, was this celebrated tailor, an international name.
A huge name. I mean, This is a man who dressed Marlon Brando, Cary Grant. His whole career was about this outward glamour. But at home, it was a different story, emotional distance. Frankly, neglect.
So Leslie grew up around all the signs of success, but without any of the warmth you'd associate with it.
He said it himself. He described his own childhood, and this is just a chilling quote, as having nothing worth remembering.
Wow.
The only thing he remembered fondly was the death of his grandmother, who he was close to. That, quote, it just speaks volumes. It points to this early, deep-seated sense of loss.
And that psychological profile, that emotional deficit, it's just so critical to understanding his later personality, isn't it? That lifelong, desperate need for affirmation.
It became the engine. That emotional vacuum drove his perfectionism. And it's important to remember, his first path wasn't even artistic.
His father sent him to study textile management at the University of Leeds.
A path chosen for him. So when he comes back to Hong Kong to pursue singing, his own passion, he's met with just outright public hostility.
The critics were vicious, weren't they? I read they dismissed his voice as being chicken-like.
Can you imagine, for a sensitive, already isolated young man to have that thrown at you?
So what did he do?
He spent a decade, 10 years of pure grinding work, meticulously cultivating what eventually became known as the silkiest Cantonese singing voice of his generation.
So he didn't just get better, he conquered the very flaw they pointed out.
He conquered it. And that process, it forges a very specific personality. For him, validation wasn't a gift, it was a conquest. Perfectionism was the engine that shot him to superstardom.
But it also became his biggest liability.
His most devastating liability, especially when that impossible standard couldn't be maintained anymore.
And this brings us to this incredible duality of 𝐏𝐎𝐃𝐃𝐒𝐓. I mean, he occupied this space in Asian culture that almost no one else ever has.
He really did. On the one hand, you have the hyper-masculine hero in the John Woo films,
Wow.
all flying bullets and codes of honor.
It's a heroic bloodshed genre. But at the exact same time, he could be the vulnerable, gender-fluid, queer protagonist in an art house film.
And he did it seamlessly. He can embody both extremes. And that let audiences see vulnerability and strength and vulnerability connected him to everyone.
Which just put this unbearable pressure on his own identity, right? Blurring the line between the performance and the person.
The public demanded both. They wanted the invincible big brother and the broken, vulnerable artist.
And then there's the role that just haunts his whole legacy, Farewell, My Concubine.
His role as DIE, the opera singer who's forced to live as a woman on stage and eventually takes his own life. The public immediately drew that parallel, life imitating art.
Which just cemented this tragic, almost doomed mythology around him.
But amid all that stardom, all that pressure, his real life was anchored by one person, his relationship with Daffy Tong Hak Tak.
And their connection went way back to childhood, but they rekindled it in 1982. Tong was his bedrock.
He was, and what Leslie did publicly for him was radical, especially for the very conservative Hong Kong of that era.
He called Tong his most beloved, openly. It was this huge statement of living authentically, of defying those norms.
But that authenticity came at a huge cost. The paparazzi attention was relentless, intrusive, and the homophobic scrutiny was constant.
So the sources say he developed this smoldering ambivalence toward his own fame.
Exactly. He finally got the validation he'd craved his whole life, but he also yearned for a quiet, simple life. And at the same time, he was addicted to the affirmation only the stage could give him.
That constant internal war, it's the perfect setup for what was coming.
It sounds like his whole identity was this internal conflict. He built himself on the love of the crowd, but that love prevented him from ever being the quiet person he wanted to be.
Precisely. And that's the key. When your entire self-worth is built on external validation that demands perfection, the second that perfection is threatened, the whole structure just collapses inward.
And that, tragically, is exactly what happened.
Okay, so let's unpack the core medical reality here, because this is where the story gets really, really interesting and shifts away from just biography.
It does. Most people focus on the depression, which is absolutely true. But the primary physical trigger for his acute distress, the thing that started dismantling that perfectionist engine, was something that sounds almost manageable.
Gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD.
Right. But we have to emphasize, this was not mild heartburn. This was not something you fix with Tums.
This was severe.
Extremely. It was a laryngeal reflux, or LPR. The stomach acid wasn't just in his esophagus, it was reaching his throat. And for a singer, most critically, his vocal cords.
Oh, that's a nightmare. It was a direct attack on the instrument that defined him.
A true physiological betrayal. The mechanism of injury here is just devastating for a vocalist. The vocal fold epithelium, this incredibly delicate protective barrier on the vocal cords, was being constantly exposed to gastric juices.
So constant inflammation, irritation, damage.
Exactly. For an average person, that's a chronic cough, maybe some hoarseness. For Leslie Cheung, known for the velvet quality of his voice, it was catastrophic.
It was professional paralysis.
Total paralysis. He couldn't hit his high notes, his control was gone, he was forced to cancel recording sessions. He described his own voice as damaged.
And you think about the decades he spent perfecting that sound.
10 years, just to get rid of that chicken-like label. And now an involuntary biological process was undoing all of it. For him, this enforced silence was nothing less than an ego death.
And I imagine it creates this brutal feedback loop. The physical pain of the reflux causes anxiety.
And anxiety is a prime trigger for making reflux worse, which damages the voice more, which increases the stress. It's a spiral.
So the acid test of his career became a literal internal erosion of his identity.
If he couldn't sing, then in his own perfectionist mind, he ceased to be Leslie Cheung. That inability to maintain the standard, that was the crack in the dam.
But the GRD, as you said, was the trigger. The root cause was the neurological collapse. We're talking about endogenous depression.
Yes, and we have to be really precise about that diagnosis.
What does endogenous mean in this context?
It's often called clinical or melancholic depression. The key thing is that it's a biochemical imbalance in the brain that happens largely independent of external sad events.
So it's not just a reaction to stress or grief, it's a biological failure.
It's a biological disease, often linked to imbalances in neurotransmitters like serotonin. He was being treated by his psychiatrist, Dr. Felice Lamack, who has been so important in clarifying this since his death.
And this diagnosis is crucial because it's resistant to just, cheering up.
Exactly. It requires complex medical intervention because it's a disease of brain chemistry. And yet, he maintained this illusion of control.
The smiling depression.
A classic textbook case. The ability to appear cheerful, friendly, functional to the outside world while battling this profound, chemically driven despair internally.
You see it so clearly in those final hours. The restaurant manager who saw him at his last lunch said he looked happy.
But his friend, Alfred Mock, who was sitting right across from him, he saw the reality. Very nervous, hands fidgeting all the way through lunch.
That mask must take an immense amount of energy to maintain.
It's exhausting. And when that energy runs out, the collapse is sudden and total. It's why so many people close to him just couldn't reconcile the final act with the man they saw just hours before.
And it's also critical to note this wasn't some sudden impulse that just appeared in 2003.
No. We have verified evidence of a prior suicide attempt in November 2002. This was a long-term cyclical battle with a biological enemy. It predated the final event by months.
So if you put it all together, the intersection of the body and the mind, his existence became untenable.
Completely. The ultimate celebrity who felt worthless, the singer whose instrument had failed him, the perfectionist who couldn't tolerate any decline.
When he wrote that final note, the very first word was depression.
It wasn't a lament. It was a medical declaration. A desperate plea to explain the cause of death was an illness that had finally overcome him.
An illness the public just couldn't accept.
They preferred a dramatic conspiracy over the reality that even an icon can be defeated by their own biology.
So now we have to layer in the external world, because a psychological autopsy demands you look at the context.
Yeah.
You have a star battling internal biological failure.
And he's doing it in an environment of total external breakdown.
Yeah.
You have to ask, what was Hong Kong like in April 2003?
It was a disaster zone, a city paralyzed by fear.
It was apocalyptic. The SARS outbreak had reached its most terrifying, uncontrolled peak. For anyone who doesn't remember the gravity of that moment, this was a literal plague gripping one of the world's most densely populated places.
The numbers alone are just stark. At the time of his death, over 1,750 cases, with the death toll climbing fast towards 300.
But the fear was bigger than the numbers. You have to mention the Amoy Gardens incident.
Yeah, that was terrifying. The virus spread through faulty sewage pipes, infecting hundreds of people in one single housing complex.
And that cemented this sense of random, inescapable doom. The feeling that even the air, the water, the buildings themselves are compromised.
They created this condition they called SARS phobia.
Every single human interaction became a risk assessment. The city imposed these strict measures, stricter limitations to personal closeness, all the normal rituals of connection gone.
Sharing a meal, a close greeting, just gathering with friends, all suspended. It was the city of masks.
Everyone was a potential vector of death. And for Cheung, who relied so heavily on his social circle, his entourage, that performance affirmation, this enforced isolation was devastating.
The very social fabric that might have caught him was just shredded by the crisis.
Think about the sensory details of it. The normally deafening streets were quiet, eerily quiet. You could feel the city holding its breath.
And the Mandarin Oriental, where he spent his final hours, was almost empty. The isolation of the building just mirrored the emptiness he felt inside.
The environment was actively working against him, undermining any chance of him reaching out for help.
And then on that specific day, April 1st, there was this added layer of surreal panic.
The 14-year-old hacker who took over the Mingpao news site.
Yeah, and that hoax was so effective because it preyed on the fear that was already there. The fake report said Hong Kong was about to be declared a plague port,
which triggered instant mass hysteria. People flooded the grocery stores, panic buying.
So even if Cheung didn't see that specific article, that atmosphere of deep apocalyptic panic was it was everywhere.
The world outside seemed to be collapsing right as his internal world was. In a strange, twisted way, the chaos might have made his decision to leave feel less
aberrant.
In a world that already felt like it was ending.
It lowered the collective threshold for despair. The external environment, a city fighting an invisible plague, was the absolute worst possible context for a man fighting his own invisible internal disease.
It was the catalyst that sealed his fate.
Okay, so let's move into the forensic reconstruction of this. We can track the final hours of April 1st, and this timeline is absolutely essential.
Because it just dispels any idea that this was a chaotic breakdown or that he was coerced. It shows a man methodically taking control of his final departure.
The internal battle starts early. At 10 a.m., we have the cry for help.
Right. He calls his confidant, Alfred 𝐏𝐿𝐴 and admits he's just driving aimlessly, feeling very tired.
But crucially, he confesses to having severe suicidal thoughts earlier that morning. He thought about speeding to his death, but he stopped himself. And the reason he gave is just so revealing of his character. He stopped because he remembered his lunch appointment with 𝐏𝐿𝐴.
That's a fundamental piece of data for an investigator. His highly developed perfectionist sense of social obligation was the only thing tethering him to life. Not self-preservation, the need to keep an appointment.
It just shows the depth of his internal conflict and the energy he was using just to seem normal.
By 11:00 a.m., he leaves his home. He tells Daffy Tongue he's going for a drive. He appears normal.
And we know Daffy was keenly aware of the depression, trying to keep close contact. So this is, again, the strain of that smiling depression mask.
Then at 1:00 p.m., we have the Last Supper with Alfred 𝐏𝐿𝐴.
Yep.
And this hour just captures that duality perfectly.
You have the two perspectives. The restaurant manager, watching from a distance, sees a star who looks happy.
But 𝐏𝐿𝐴, sitting across from him, sees the truth. He's very nervous. His hands are fidgeting all the way through lunch. It's this constant, unconscious sign of severe internal stress.
And during the meal, he makes this implicit farewell. He mentions leaving a small gift for 𝐏𝐿𝐴 in his will.
Which 𝐏𝐿𝐴, understandably dismisses. He thinks it's just morbid celebrity talk. He doesn't realize it's a literal final act.
And then the end of their meeting is just chilling. As he drops 𝐏𝐿𝐴 off, he says, "You don't have to call me anymore."
That is a clean, calculated severance of that emotional tether.
By 4:00 p.m., he arrives at the Mandarin Oriental. This wasn't a random spot.
Not at all. He was a regular at the private club on the 24th floor. It was familiar. It was safe. He orders a drink, cigarettes, an apple. He goes to the balcony to watch the sunset. It's all calm, routine behavior.
Which again just underscores the methodical control he had.
And that control culminates at 4:30 p.m. with the arrangements. This is probably the most crucial detail for understanding his motivation. He calls his manager, Florence Chan.
And he gives her a very specific instruction. Wait for him at the taxi stand outside the hotel lobby.
So let's analyze that. Why do that? Why involve his manager at that exact moment?
It's an act of dignity.
An ultimate act of dignity. He knew the celebrity machine. He knew the paparazzi. He was making sure that a trusted friend would be the first person to receive him.
To handle the immediate aftermath.
And prevent his body from being exposed to the tabloids, to strangers. It was a final protective measure against the very fame that had suffocated him. He also reportedly spoke to Daffy one last time, keeping his tone carefully fine so Daffy wouldn't rush over and try to intervene.
He used that final hour to manage the fallout, and then at 6:41 p.m., he writes the note.
He asks a waiter for a pen and paper. And the text is just so powerful in its brevity. Depression. Thank you to all my friends. In my life, I have done nothing wrong. Why does it have to be like this?
That first word, depression, with the exclamation point, it can't be overstated. It's the title. It's the explanation.
It's the final diagnosis. It's a desperate attempt to frame the event, not as a character flaw, but as the end of a biological battle he felt powerless to stop.
And 2 minutes later, at 6:43 p.m., the fall.
The timeline just shows complete autonomy, intention, and this intense final effort to control the environment around an uncontrolled internal breakdown.
And yet, despite that clear timeline, despite the medical evidence, the conspiracy theories persist. And they persist because they rely on these perceived physical anomalies at the scene.
So we have to apply forensic data to resolve these. The most persistent one is the no blood anomaly.
Right. The theory that the absence of a massive external blood pool proves he was killed somewhere else or the death was staged.
And this just betrays a complete misunderstanding of the physics of a deceleration trauma injury.
Okay, so let's walk through the forensic explanation of this. It's critical to understand the mechanics. He fell from the 24th floor, but he did not hit the pavement directly at terminal velocity.
Absolutely not. His fall was significantly broken on the way down. He likely struck a pedestrian railing, maybe an awning, some lower-level structure around the second floor.
And that intermediate impact is the key.
It's everything. It absorbs enormous kinetic energy, causing a rapid, sudden deceleration. The injuries from that are overwhelmingly internal. A ruptured aorta, shattered liver and spleen. The victim dies almost instantly from those internal forces,
So why no external blood?
because the skin is remarkably elastic. In these cases, the skin often remains substantially intact, and it effectively acts as a container for the massive internal bleeding.
So all the bleeding happened inside his body cavity.
Exactly. There was no major open wound or explosive head trauma on the final impact because the velocity had already been reduced. That's why the witnesses described the body as looking like someone fainted.
The lack of external gore is actually a forensic feature of this kind of fall, not evidence of staging.
Precisely. The preservation of his famously beautiful face, which people cite as proof, was a grim stroke of physics. It means the primary impact was his torso, and the final impact was a low-velocity tumble. The evidence is unequivocal.
Okay, what about the second big one? The autopsy waiver controversy. The claim that the family rushed to waive it to hide drugs or poison or signs of a struggle.
Again, this just ignores the cultural and legal reality of the Hong Kong coroner system in 2003.
It was standard practice.
This is a very common practice. Pathologists who worked on the case have since confirmed that coroners were highly sympathetic to families who wanted to avoid the, quote, desecration of an autopsy, especially if the cause of death was obvious.
Which it was. Suicide by fall, confirmed by a note and witnesses.
This wasn't unique to him. The rate of autopsies in Hong Kong had systematically dropped from around 7% to 40% in these kinds of cases during that period because of this leniency.
So his case just fit the system. It wasn't an anomaly engineered to hide something.
And the family's motivation was clear. Daffy Tung and Cheung's sister wanted to preserve his dignity. They were terrified the tabloid press would leak graphic details from the autopsy. Waiving it was a protective measure, not a conspiracy.
Right. The idea that police and doctors would risk their entire careers to cover this up just makes zero logical sense.
And what's so fascinating is the anatomy of that denial. When a public figure represents such perfection, such invincibility, it's very hard for people to accept a vulnerable human failure like biological depression.
So the grief mutates into conspiracy theories just to maintain the myth of the invincible gore.
So let's look at the major narratives. Let's start with the love triangle murder theory. The idea he was killed by a jealous lover or over a triad dispute.
The evidence for this is what?
Non-existent. Police closed the case quickly. There were no suspects. CCTV showed him entering the club alone and remaining alone on the balcony.
And the behavioral evidence doesn't line up either.
Not at all. Daffy Tong's subsequent 2 decades of very public, verifiable grief remaining single, protecting Cheung's legacy, that is profoundly inconsistent with the behavior of a guilty party. You don't dedicate your life to mourning someone you helped murder.
Right. Okay, next up, the political assassination theory. That he was silenced by the CCP because he knew too much.
This one appeals to anti-establishment sentiment, but it lacks any logical motive. He was an actor and a singer, not a political activist. He was beloved in mainland China. His death caused far more cultural damage than silencing him ever would have.
And the sources for these claims are always, pretty fringe.
They are. Highly politically charged outlets using vague reasoning rather than actual evidence. There's just no logic to support a state-sponsored hit on a pop star. It's projecting political anxiety onto a personal tragedy.
Then you have the more supernatural theories, the occult curse.
The idea he was possessed after filming his last movie, Inner Senses, where he played a psychiatrist tormented by ghosts.
This is a classic example of using a supernatural metaphor to explain a real medical problem, isn't it?
It's a textbook case. He did struggle to shed that depressed character, which is a known hazard of method acting. The lines can get blurred.
But that's professional exhaustion and psychological blending. It's not spirit possession.
And the claims about feng shui masters predicting his short life are all post hoc cold reading. They only appear after the tragedy.
And finally, we have to address the most bizarre recent one, the 2025 Alive hoax.
Yeah, this one saw a strange resurgence. The claim that investigations proved Cheung was alive, and the whole thing was a staged show.
This is just pure digital misinformation, right? Clickbait.
It's driven by social media engagement. It likely came from a semantic confusion with a completely different, unrelated story that was misinterpreted. And it usually hinges on a supposed look-like spotted somewhere.
You have to anchor yourself in logical reality here. The possibility that a fan or a doppelganger exists is infinitely more plausible than a 22-year-long faked death.
To stage that, you would need the collusion of the police, the coroner, the funeral home, his entire family, Daffy Tong, Florence Chan, The conspiracy would have to be airtight across multiple institutions for over 2 decades.
It's baseless digital noise designed to exploit people's emotional vulnerability and their desire for the icon to still be out there.
So if we connect this whole story back to the broader sociological picture, the most immediate and tragic effect of his death was the trigger it pulled on that already fragile city.
It set off the Werther effect, a contagion of suicide that just gripped SARS-stricken Hong Kong.
The statistics are horrifyingly stark. The suicide rate in Hong Kong increased sixfold in April 2003 compared to the month before. Sixfold.
Just staggering. And within 9 hours of his jump.
Police reported that 6 women had committed suicide by jumping from heights across the city.
The mechanism there is just so clear. The media romanticizing the death, those headlines like "The Butterfly Falls," combined with the hopelessness of SARS.
It lowered the threshold for vulnerable people. They saw their untouchable idol choose an exit, and it legitimized that option for them to escape their own suffering.
Despite that, the funeral itself was this profound, defiant cultural moment.
Thousands of fans, defying the strict SARS warnings against gathering, came out to mourn. And Daffy Tong stood front and center, publicly confirming his role as the grieving partner, cementing their relationship in history.
But even that love story has this toxic side, which reveals the ongoing weight of fandom. You still see it today.
Oh, absolutely. The social media backlash against Daffy in 2025 for allegedly having a new partner. There's this chilling demand that the surviving partner must remain a perpetual widow to the icon.
The public wants the myth of perfect love to continue, even at the expense of the living person's happiness.
So when we look for the definitive conclusion, what does it all mean? It remains absolute.
Yeah.
Leslie Cheung died by suicide.
A suicide due to severe, biologically driven, endogenous depression.
Compounded by the devastating physical cruelty of GR-induced vocal loss, all taking place in an environment of extreme, plague-induced isolation.
The conspiracy theories, as fascinating as they are to dissect, are ultimately just psychological defense mechanisms.
They're the public's collective inability to reconcile the perfect image of the invincible Gore with the brutal, vulnerable reality of a man defeated by his own chemistry. It's easier to invent a murder plot than to accept the mundane reality of biology.
His true tragedy wasn't some glamorous cinematic ending.
No. The tragedy is that he was a perfectionist whose most prized instrument failed him, and a sensitive soul trapped in a dying city that had lost its ability to connect.
And to truly honor his legacy, I think we have to look past that myth and just acknowledge the immense, very human and biologically driven pain that led to his departure. His note started with depression for a reason.
It was a final plea to recognize the illness that took him. His lasting impact lies in that very human fragility, recognizing the profound difference between the perfect icon we demanded him to be.
And the struggling, flawed person he actually was.
A deeply complex figure facing down a biological enemy that all the fame, fortune, and adoration in the world just could not defeat.
Thank you for diving deep with us into the reality behind the enduring myth of Leslie Cheung.